o'clock. That means it's time to get this party started. My name is David Fisher, and it is my distinct honor to be co-chair of Ron Paul's presidential campaign here in Iowa. I am one of 17 elected members of the Republican Party of Iowa's State Central Committee. That is the governing board of the Iowa GOP. And 5 of those 17 members have endorsed Ron Paul for president. That's 4 more than any other candidate. I've got 2 of my friends with me from that board tonight too. Dr. Drew Ivers is our state chairman. Mr. A.J. Spiker is here as well. We've had a lot of people endorsing Ron Paul for president lately, as a matter of fact. Several state representatives have endorsed Ron Paul for president. And you may have heard that just 24 hours ago, State Senator Kent Sorensen endorsed Ron Paul for president. And I think I had heard that Senator Sorensen had previously been affiliated with another candidate, but we're delighted that he's found his way home to us. So this Ron Paul guy is getting more and more popular, and we have a lot of evidence of that, not to mention the size of the crowd in the room tonight. The polls are telling us that Ron Paul is, without question, a top-tier candidate. Yeah. The polls tell us that Ron Paul can beat the other Republicans. He can beat Barack Obama. Something else that the polls have told us is that Iowans see Ron Paul as the most principled and most fiscally responsible candidate in the race. Now let's think about that. The most principled, the most fiscally responsible candidate. Who here thinks that that's maybe just what America needs right now? Well, folks, we have a job to do. It's our job as Iowans. It's our responsibility to get to the caucuses Tuesday night and tell the rest of America which of these presidential candidates has the message that the rest of America needs to be paying attention to. So I want you to make the commitment. Let's make the commitment to turn out Tuesday night. Bring your family, bring your friends, bring your neighbors. Ron Paul has a very important message that you're about to hear. I know we're all concerned about the direction America's headed, but it's my hope that this optimistic and inspiring message will make you want to make the commitment to get to the caucuses Tuesday night to help Ron Paul elevate this vital message onto the national stage with a big night Tuesday at the Iowa caucuses. Now let's hear this vital message. Ron Paul is the 12-term conservative Republican congressman. He is the consistent, principled conservative that America needs right now. He's the father of the Tea Party and the champion of the Constitution, Dr. Ron Paul.
To meet with a lot of undecideds. So it's great to have that nice reception. Before I get started, I want to introduce 2 members of my family, 2 granddaughters, Lisa and Linda. They're standing over here. And I want you to know they have endorsed me for the nomination for the presidency of the United States. No, it is great to see everybody out. It's good to see a nice crowd. The campaign has been going well. Have you noticed? Yeah. So, and it's something that's very important to all of us. It's important to what I've been doing for a long time. It's important to what we're trying to do in a campaign, but it's important for you to know what our problems are and what we ought to do. So this is where I feel like we're making some progress. There's been a long time since I've been talking about these issues. I got interested in politics a long time ago. Most of you know that I practiced medicine for a long time, but during that period of time, even as a resident, I was interested in studying economic policy. And I never could quite figure out how, when I met people in politics, they would talk about politics, but they never talked about economics. But how can you separate the two? Because the politicians are always messing up the economy, and they need to know a lot more reason Maybe that's the reason. Maybe they don't know enough about it. And you know, I can remember the very first time I was on a radio program, and that was in the early 70s. I was running for Congress, and they introduced me as a doctor. And somebody called in and they said, "Is he a PhD in economics?" And I said, no, I'm an MD. The guy was relieved. He says, "Oh, that's wonderful. I thought you were going to be a PhD in economics, and we didn't need that." That's sort of like saying, "I'm relieved you're not another attorney to go to Washington, D.C." But economics has been something that has fascinated me because I have been interested. I've spent a lifetime in medicine, interested in how people live and how they survive. But you have to understand economics if you want to know why we have the business cycle, why we have employment, why we have inflation, why we have an upside and a downside, a bubble and a collapse, and why do we run up these deficits, and how do they get away with it? And just really what is the actual cause of these problems that we face. In the 1970s, there was a confirmation of what Austrian economics taught throughout the many decades, but certainly in the 60s, they were saying that the monetary system we had was unsustainable because it was a pseudo-gold standard, and we were pretending it was a real gold standard, and we said our dollar was as good as gold. Well, it really wasn't. And finally, the market overwhelmed. The markets are very powerful. The Fed is very powerful. I'll talk a little bit more about that and what we ought to do with the Fed. but the markets are very powerful, and politicians are powerful, the taxing authorities are powerful, the people who run the Federal Reserve and central banks, they're very powerful. But the market is the most powerful. It's just that the market sometimes is delayed and it takes time. And it's the market that forces the correction. The people who cause the bubbles and spend the money and have the deficits and print the money and all these things, for the most part, the people who go along with it are well-intentioned. There are a few who know exactly what they're doing, and they are gathering in their power, and they know how to build big government from that. But most people tend to want to help other people. But it tends to backfire on them, no matter whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy. So if we introduce this notion, which has been in our schools for so long, that if we manage the economy, if we plan the economy, we can come up with an alternative to true freedom, you know, true free markets where the people decide how to spend their money. No, that's too radical. So that was more or less rejected in our 1930s. At the same time, Americans have been pretty nervous about electing socialists. People claim they're socialists. Too often we get some there anyway because they argue that there's something else. But they come up with this idea, and in economics they have taught this, that, well, there's something in between. Just have a planned economy and help the people who need the help. So it is well-intentioned. The people endorse it. The politicians endorse it. They get re-elected. The only problem is it's deeply flawed, and it fails. And that's what we're witnessing today. There's been ups and downs over the many decades. It got much worse since 1971 because there is no restraint at all on spending, and the dollar was delinked from gold, which then allowed the politicians to depend on the Federal Reserve to print the money when they need it. You know, it sounds like a pretty good deal, permanent prosperity, and it really seemed to have been working with the housing. You know, the people in the Congress that write these bills and say, you must make these loans even if the people don't qualify. The Fed will print the money and make it available, and then the prices of houses will go up and the people will borrow against the equity. It's perpetual prosperity, and it just sounds wonderful. And then they can all sit back and say, just think, more people own houses than ever before. But what they didn't recognize, what would happen is those individuals who were managing the affairs, the mortgage companies and the banks and the corporations, they just took advantage of the whole thing, and they got into gambling with derivatives, and they ran up these huge debts, and all of a sudden the bubble popped and they were under the gun. But the problem was there, is even the market could have solved that at that point if they would have been allowed to go bankrupt. That's what should have happened to people who were But instead, the politicians reacted because the people on Wall Street were screaming they had to be bailed out, they had to be bailed out. And I recall people running back to Congress at the end of '08. They started bailing out in the early part of '08. At the end of '08, TARP funds were passed. That was nearly $1 trillion. But that was peanuts compared to what the Federal Reserve was doing. You know, we have been demanding, and we have gotten a partial audit of the Fed, but we finally found a lot more about what they were doing. And by the way, that should be the goal of all Americans. Regardless of what we end up doing with the Fed, the very first step is for Congress to live up to their responsibility and find out exactly what the Fed is doing and get a full audit of the Federal Reserve. Though I've been doing that for 30 years, trying to put pressure, we've had a partial audit, and there's been some court cases, and we have learned a whole lot. And we will continue to do that. But if it is to be that I am to be your president, believe me, the pressure will be put on even more so to find out exactly what benefit out of the Federal Reserve. Peanuts that we're talking about. We're talking about a lot of money. They actually dealt with $15 trillion in and out, lending, bailing out banks and special corporations. And about half of it, $7 trillion, was used overseas. And that was in '08, '09. But we're involved very much right now. Everybody's involved in this because it's a dollar phenomenon. The dollar, we had the privilege, because it used to be backed by gold. We took the gold away, but they kept trusting us to keep printing the money. They take our money, we buy cheap goods overseas, our jobs go overseas, they end up with our dollars overseas. But the whole banking system is built on a debt based in dollars. So the banks are involved, the central banks of Europe are involved, and guess what? The countries over there are as bankrupt as ours, or if not more. So there's Greek debt bought and held by banks in that country, and their central bank backs them up. And we're over there, and Bernanke has already promised that he would be there to make sure that they're bailed out. But I tell you what, it doesn't help the American citizen. It hurts us, because the creation of new money devalues the currency. The devaluation of currency is the way you destroy the middle class, and it's the way you transfer the wealth from the middle class to the wealthy. And just look at what's happening today. The middle class is shrinking, the debt is exploding, and still the wealth is being accumulated into the smaller and smaller hands. The only thing I advise when you think about the people who have accumulated great wealth, because I have strong criticism of those who have made that wealth off us and off the government and off privileges. People who make wealth and earn wealth because they provide a good service for us. If you get a good product and you buy it, and the price is right, and the product is good, and they make a lot of money, that is a lot different than the people who use the government. Right now, today, big business makes more money paying high-paid lobbyists going to Washington and get a good deal than trying to satisfy you, the customer, and that has to be reversed. Economies finally hit the wall and we have to do something, it's the debt. The debt is the big problem. And it's been nice when it's going up, borrow money, and everybody looks wealthy, and the country looks apparently wealthy still in spite of the bad recession, but it's a depression for the people unemployed. They tell you the unemployment rate has gone down a little bit from 9 down to 8.6. We're supposed to feel good about it. But you know what? If you look at the statistics and how you measured unemployment during the Depression, the real unemployment figure is 22%. That's why people don't buy into the propaganda from Washington, D.C. Then they come along and they say, oh, there's no inflation. Inflation is 1 or 2%. Therefore, the people on fixed incomes, like on Social Security, they don't qualify for an increase. That's the way to lower their check, by not giving a cost of living increase at the same time devaluing the currency. But the real rate of inflation calculated with the old CPI, which they changed because they didn't like the old CPI, so they used another one. They're talking about changing that again. The CPI now is probably about 9%. And I think most American people would believe that. But then that still doesn't answer the question of why people are so unhappy. Is because if you're in the middle class or low middle class, your bill, or a fixed income, if you're living off Social Security, your inflation rate might be higher. But the people who get the money first, get the money when it has higher value, the money circulates, prices go up, and you may not even be in a tax category, and you're not paying huge amounts in income tax, but you're paying the inflation tax. And that's a high penalty. So it is a distribution of wealth that goes from one group to another. Now, the magnificent thing about America, when we were a much freer country and believed in sound money and limited government and property rights, the magnificent thing was that we were known as a country that was very wealthy, very free, and we had the richest, biggest middle class in the history of the world. But not today. I mean, not today. It is struggling. The middle class is shrinking. Yes, the middle class shrinks. It makes it more difficult to take care of oneself and one's family, but there's a group then that has to go on total dependency of the government. But how can they totally depend on the government when the government is unable to deliver the goods? The government has nothing. The government creates nothing. All they can do is shuffle goods and services back and forth, and that breeds distrust and problems, and that is what we're facing today. That's what this economic crisis is all about, and the world is changing. I can tell you that I talked about this 4 years ago. We got a lot of attention, and yet not the type of attention that we really could shift here. But the country has shifted tremendously in these last 4 years. They know there's an economic crisis. They know we have to start living within our means, that we know that we have to change our spending habits. But also, the American people have changed their attitude about the waste and the spending that we do overseas, and they're paying a lot of attention to the policy of non-intervention and start talking about getting rid of so many of these wars and talking about bringing our troops home and having a the economic fallacies that annoys me the most is that, and we hear it now, we hear it said in Washington because there are some who would like to start another war. There's people, our president right now is said to be working on getting more involved in Syria, and they can't wait. Some just can't wait till the shooting starts over Iran. But the one thing that people still say, and there's still people that will believe this because it's been taught in our schools, and that is war, especially World War II, ended the Depression. That is an absolute fallacy. War cannot help your economic well-being. The only thing it did, the only thing that World War II did was it lowered the unemployment, but the alternative of being unemployed was carrying a gun and getting shot at and 600,000 being killed. So that is not the way you end a depression. Besides, I remember World War II, and I remember the tail end of the Depression, and things weren't going good in the Depression, but they weren't better during the war because that's when you had rationing and that's when you had shortages. We didn't make cars, and so the Depression continued. The war and the Depression ended after World War II ended. And guess what they did at the end of World War II? By that time, the malinvestment and the debt has been liquidated. You know, bills had been paid, so we got rid of the mistakes of the 1920s, finally, after the government had too much intervention in the 30s and prevented this from happening. But after World War II, there was an argument with the liberal economists. They say, oh, the Depression is coming back again. We have to have jobs programs. We have 10 million people coming home and they're going to be unemployed, and we have to, you know, spend even more money and give them government jobs in order to stop the Depression. But, you know, they didn't even have a time to get around to it. The soldiers were anxious to come home, and they came home. 10 million returned to this country. And did they spend more money? No. The budget was cut approximately 60%. Slashed the budget 60%. What did they do with taxes? They lowered them. They lowered them by 30-some%. And that finally ended the Depression. And they got jobs. That's when we started rebuilding again. So we don't have to worry about saying that we can't cut spending because it's going to hurt. You have to decide who gets to spend the money. I've been in Washington for a few years, and I can assure you, the politicians and the bureaucrats I know do not know anything about how you should spend your money. You should spend your own money. It's yours. In this country understand we have natural rights, we have God-given rights, our life and our liberty. But we have failed to follow through and say if we have a right to our life and our liberty, why don't we have the right to keep the fruits of our labor? That's what we need. What kind of a tax would we have if you had a right to keep the fruits of your labor? Guess what? We would have the kind of tax on income that the founders thought we had and wasn't reversed until 1913. That is, we wouldn't have an income tax. That's a wonderful thing to talk about, and people say, that's a dream, that's old-fashioned, you can't do that. But to tell you the truth, if we had the right kind of government, if we followed, you know, one little promise that we make when we go to Washington, if everybody took their oath of office seriously, believe me, government would be very much smaller and we would not need an income tax. But once again, something else would have to happen. The appetite for government would have to change. One person in Washington or a couple people in the Congress can't change that. We as a people have to change our attitudes, and we have to understand what the role of government should be. The founders knew exactly what they wanted. They were sick and tired of the king. They were sick and tired of his military forces coming into their houses, sick and tired of the taxations and the regulations. So they knew what they wanted. There was a revolution. Fortunately for us, we won the revolution, and they wrote a document which was not perfect but darn good. And that they had, the sole goal there was for the protection of liberty. In political action, I believe that should be our cause. If you get involved in politics or you're looking at candidates, really the person you want and the job you want and the effort should all be directed toward protecting our individual liberty. Was written with a lot of restraints. It's almost a thou shalt not type of document. Thou shalt not on the federal government. It didn't mean that there was going to be dictates to the states. The states were going to be varied and they're going to be different and they're going to have to sort out a lot of their own problems. But the government was to be local, not at national. And yet today, the national government supersedes just about everything that the states do. They can overrule the state's law. There's a dictum now that says federal law all supersedes the state. That doesn't confine or confirm with what we believe the 9th and the 10th Amendment say. The federal government doesn't supersede state law. State law should supersede the federal government, and the federal government should protect that right for the states to run their affairs as they see fit. In Article 1, Section 8, there's about 20 things listed on what we can properly do, what authority is given. And they are explicit. What is not explicit is excluded. And that is why they wrote the 9th and 10th Amendment. In Article 1, Section 8 has some very good provisions in it. One is honest money. Gold and silver is legal tender. No central bank. No central bank has ever been authorized by the Constitution. There's another thing that could have saved us a lot of grief. There's something in there that said that the president, the executive branch, cannot take the people to war without a proper document. And the document comes from the Congress and is called a declaration of war. Just think of how many less wars, less dying, and less debt we would have if we'd have been a lot more cautious in the way we would go to war in the last 50 or 60 years. But unfortunately, we have permitted the federal government to get way too big. Not only do I worry a bit about the size and scope of our federal government intruding onto our liberties, but I also worry about what's happening internationally, how easy it is to gravitate to the next level. Just think now, The presidents don't come to the Congress. You know, the business in Libya and the probability of being involved in Syria right now. The president doesn't come to the Congress, but they take orders from NATO and United Nations. We should not give up our sovereignty to these international organizations. War is always an economic issue. Pretend it isn't. Some people think, well, foreign policy is one thing, it's not economic. It's a big economic issue, war, especially because of the expenditures. In the last 10 years, with the constant wars going on, I think most Americans couldn't name every single country. I'm not even positive I can name every single place we're fighting, and that's a tragedy. But I can name the big ones, and there are way too many places. But in the last 10 years, we added $10 trillion to our national debt for the wars that we've been fighting overseas. I do not feel safer because of that. I feel more vulnerable economically. I feel more vulnerable, but our liberties are being challenged because of the circumstance of this constant war. Right after 9/11, there was deep concern. American people were united, and we had to do something. I certainly was in support of going after those individuals who were responsible. And unfortunately, though, there was a lot of distraction because some saw that as an opportunity to actually use it as an excuse to go into Iraq, because they had planned for 6 or 7 years for an excuse to go into Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. There was no Al-Qaeda there. Saddam Hussein, as bad as he was, he hated the Al-Qaeda and he didn't like the Iranians. And yet we went in there and fought that war. A lot of people lost lives, a lot of money spent, a lot of injuries. Still, a lot of people, the military people coming home, they have a lot of problems, medical problems that they're not getting taken care of. There's an epidemic of suicide because of the conditions they went through and the lack of care they get back here at home. But if for a minute I thought that would help us and made us safer and our country was threatened, yes, we should. Matter of fact, my first speech against the Iraq War was in 1998. Because that's when they said we were going to have regime change. I said, this is going to lead to a war. When we got right down to passing a resolution on Iraq, I'm on foreign affairs, I made a vote on a declaration of war. I told them, I said, I'm not voting for this. I don't want to go to war. But if you want to go to war, this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to vote for this. They became near hysterical over that to make them vote for that. So we had a vote, and it was a voice vote, and I said, I'm going to make you record your vote. So I made them record the vote. And of course, nobody voted. They didn't want the responsibility of making this decision, so they didn't vote. They said to let the president decide. But it was an amazing discussion that went on. It included even the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the time. And I was arguing the case for the Constitution, and it was explained to me. They said, well, that part of the Constitution is anachronistic. We don't follow that anymore. That is generally the attitude there, and that's why there's not much left to our document. That's why we're hanging by the strings on whether or not we're going to renew these beliefs and get back to constitutional government. So the attitude is that you can do what you want. The courts really don't protect us. If it gets into the courts, they start legislating. And the president, he legislates, and the Congress doesn't do anything. The Congress is supposed to give us sound money, and they don't do anything. So this is the reason we have all these departments, you know, and part of my plan to cut back, I want to get rid of 5 departments, but top of my list is a department. My list is the Department of Education. I hope you don't like that. If we had people truly believing that the Constitution should be honored, you wouldn't have that. Now, if the people of this country said, no, some states, their educational system isn't good, and we have to help them out, and you should amend the Constitution if you want to believe in the rule of law. But to ignore the Constitution on the money issue, ignore the law on the war issue, ignore the law on all the agencies and the creations of a Department of Education, all these other departments, what is left? And right now, our personal liberties are under attack. And this is something that is a serious problem. The thing that you don't have to worry about is a weak military. We have a powerful military. We will not be attacked. We have more weapons than everybody else put together, and nobody will dare ever attack us. They're not about to invade this country anytime. The oath of office says something about all enemies, you know, foreign and domestic. And so we had a major crisis after 9/11, as I said. I voted for this authority. I was disappointed that they didn't pay attention to what they were doing and went and diverted away. And it took 10 years to get somebody they should have gotten in 3 weeks because they had bin Laden cornered at Tora Bora. But I don't know all the details there, but it lingered way too long. So when right after 9/11, you know, people were concerned, and rightfully so, and I understand it. But within a week or so, they brought a bill to the floor that had been floating around for quite a few years. And it was nothing more, from my viewpoint, it was a bill to repeal the Fourth Amendment. They called it the Patriot Act. And believe me, it wasn't very patriotic. So now the Patriot Act has endorsed the power for the federal government to know everything about you, whether it's your telephone, your internet, your mail, your houses, searches, without proper warrants. They don't have to go to a judge. The people doing the investigation and coming into your homes, they can write their own search warrants. Matter of fact, they can come into our houses today, and they can search, and they can go through your papers, and if you're there, and the law says that if you tell anybody, you can't tell anybody that the government had been in there and ransacked your house and went through your papers. If you go to an attorney or you go to court, then you've committed another felony, another federal felony. This is not very good. Now, the Patriot Act, of course, the best thing to do about the Patriot Act, instead of tinkering around with it, which we should if we can improve it, but we really should repeal a law like the Patriot Act. Been good for the cause of personal liberty, because about a year ago the president announced, because there's so many bad people around, that he has to really go after them to protect us, and he makes that case. There's dangerous people. There are some dangerous people out there. There's a lot of them, and most of them get a trial. But he changed the rules. He says now it is proper for the president to decide to assassinate an American citizen without a trial and without charges, because he thinks they're that dangerous. And of course, he's done this already. There's been three killed, and one that was probably a pretty bad actor, even though nobody ever charged him or said he committed a crime, but he preached some doctrines that would actually be very harmful. But that is one thing, but not denying him a trial is another thing. So he was killed in Yemen by a cruise missile, or with a drone. So we got rid of that guy, and somebody beside him got killed as well. But then they decided that his son was also one of the bad guys, so the next week they sent a drone missile after his son. So they got his son, they assassinated him and his cousin. They were barbecuing out in the backyard, and they were 16 and 17 years old. The son was 16 years of age. So as bad as they were, even Adolf Eichmann, finally when he was captured, he was taken to Israel. Israel gave him a trial. What did we do with the Nazis, war criminals after World War II? They got trials. Yeah, and they got what was deserving. They got hung. But I tell you what, this idea that we can make these decisions and not say anything, this is very, very dangerous. Just 2 weeks ago, it got worse on this. This was with the National Defense Authorization Act. I keep being amazed and I'm impressed and I'm pleased that people do know about this. I just mentioned that, and you know what is coming because you must be keeping up, and I'm sure you're not hearing it from the evening news because they're not talking about it. Maybe the internet's been helping us. What that bill does is essentially repeals posse comitatus, and now they have authorized and said that the military can arrest us, and you are denied an attorney, a trial, and you can be held indefinitely at a secret prison, even overseas, or at Guantanamo. Now, this is getting bad, and what the charge is, or the reason it is, that you might have become associated with an organization. But that might mean nobody defines associated. Maybe that's looking at a website, donating to a group that happens to be a bad group and you didn't know it, or attending a meeting. What if you become anti-war and speak out? You know, in this country, sometimes when you're a strong anti-war person, they think, hey, there's something wrong with you. Just think of what they did in the 60s with the FBI. You know, anti-war group, you were an automatically bad guy. So now, and I've been on the receiving end of some pretty severe criticism because I want to go to war in a very precise manner, and all of a sudden they throw some pretty nasty terms at us. So this is not good on in the direction that we're going. And now there's also an attack, there's a bill floating around Congress to really come down hard on the internet, to monitor the internet in every way possible, and of course it's designed to prevent piracy, and always for good reasons like patriotism and these things. So, but that bill is going through Congress right now, and it's getting a lot of support. It's the kind of thing that if it ever came to my desk and I had the authority, it would get vetoed. In my proposal to get us back on our economic footing, it is, of course, to cut $1 trillion out of the budget the first year. Half of this would come from the overseas spending. It would cut, not one penny would come out of national defense. Because there's a difference between military spending and defense spending. Military spending is doing what we're just doing right now, sending 38 planes over there to the Middle East because they're getting ready for some more war. People getting weapons from us and maintaining these bases around the world. Have been said that we've left Iraq. We really haven't. We have an embassy there, and it's the biggest embassy in the world. We now have hired 17,000 civilians to work in there instead of the military. But the military is around there, and if people in this country sometimes get mixed up on this, but the best way to think about it, if you ever have a wonder on whether we should do that or shouldn't do that, just try to use the golden rule on this. What would we think if a powerful nation, say China, gets more powerful and they would do that to us? How would we react? And we wouldn't like it, I'll tell you that. Saving money overseas and stopping the wars would be a tremendous boost to our economy. We would have to cut departments. I have 5 departments I would cut. Department of Education being the first. But also we'd have to go back a few years to pick up the baseline. And I picked 2006 because at that time government was plenty big enough in 2006, and we ought to be able to, that's what you would have to do with your budget. You'd have to cut back, and governments have to cut back. But unfortunately, the economic philosophy of the last 50, 60, even 70 years has been, both by many conservatives and most liberals, is that deficits don't matter and debt is not bad. And if the economy slows up, you're supposed to spend more money. They don't ask, well, you might not be spending money because you have too much debt. Maybe you might worry about losing your job. Maybe one member of the family did lose their job. And maybe your debt is too high. and you need to cut back. But government say you're supposed to spend because debt is good, and that'll stimulate the economy, and that's how everybody will get jobs again. But they believe that if you don't do it, that they direct the government to do it. The government has to spend the money. But where are they going to get the money? You know, what if there's a weak economy? They can't raise taxes. Actually, tax revenues are down. And that's part of the reason why we have this huge deficit. Tax revenues are down, so they can't really raise taxes. It will crash the economy. They have borrowed for years, and we've borrowed too much, and we're deeply in debt. But the borrowing, if you borrow too much, it tends to push interest rates up, and nobody wants higher interest rates. At least the banks don't want higher interest rates. Maybe if you're, maybe if you save some money and you're in retirement and you have some CDs, you might want some higher interest rates, and you deserve higher interest rates if that's the market rate. But the government keeps them artificially low. But they still come up short, and that is why then they go to printing the money and paying the bills that way. But we have to cut, we have to go back to sound budgeting. The budget that they use in Washington is nothing more than total deception on what they talk about. You know, for months, if not years, they talk about cutting spending, but there's nobody who's talked about cutting spending. I would venture to bet that I'm the only one who's talking about real cuts, you know. They work on projected increases. They call it baseline budgeting, and they work it into the system that everybody's budget is going to go up at a steady rate. And so they said that last summer when they couldn't get the debt increased, they said, well, what we'll do is we'll have the super committee. They were probably super smart. And, but they weren't super smart and they couldn't do it, so the alternative was we were supposed to cut $1.2 trillion, which won't happen because they will rescind it. But even these cuts aren't cuts. They only start in 2013, and it's $1 trillion over 10 years. You know, it's not even close. But the real problem is the philosophy of government. What should the government be doing? Should our government be the policeman of the world? The answer for me is no. Should we pretend that we can take care of people from cradle to grave and provide all their needs? We don't have the money. We can't do that either. So, and it's not in our Constitution to do that. So, back to the beginning of my talk, what should the role of government be? The role of government should be designed to protect our liberties, and we should assume the responsibility. Now the wonderful thing is that we were blessed to have a very great document, and it worked very well for a long time. We became the most prosperous, we had the largest middle class. But in the last 100 years, it's not just one or two administrations. It's been a while. We've been slipping and sliding. So the foreign policy changed. It was back in the teens when we really got into trouble. Woodrow Wilson is not one of my favorite presidents. So it was, getting into war, creating the Federal Reserve, the income tax, and it's been downhill to a large degree, even though we have still been blessed with a lot of prosperity. But now, what we have, the apparent wealth, when we see our wealth, there's so much debt behind it. Most of the wealth is debt. There's a debt burden. And that's why the people are sensing that there's a major crisis going on. But we had this experiment, it worked very well, and it was an experiment, it was a rare experiment. Most of history has been bogged down by dictators, and even the world's bogged down by dictators. And yet we have gotten away from, how a free society works. We know we are a great nation, we know we have good values, but where did we come up with this idea that we are so good that we can force everybody else to live exactly the way we live? I think that is a mistake to come up with. We have a responsibility to our children, and that's a job and a half, conveying our values to our children. But we don't go to our neighbors and grab them by their collar and tell them that we're going to do it. We can't do this around the world. But if we have a great system, if we have sound money and free markets and property rights and personal liberty and all these things and great prosperity and a huge middle class, then the world would look at us and they say, that is a great nation, why don't we emulate the United States? And that would be a much better way of doing it than trying to use force and violence. The principles of liberty is that it brings people together, and I sincerely believe this. It brings people together, has different values. You don't have to agree on everything. The only thing you have to agree on is freedom, freedom of choice in your personal life. It was approximately 100 years ago that we took liberty and chopped it into two pieces. We talked about personal liberties and civil liberties, and that was different than economic liberties. And some people, argue the case for each. But if you understand personal individual liberty, it's the same. It's your life and the fruits of your labor. It's your economic liberty. It's your personal choices. We understand this pretty well when it comes to religious freedoms. We don't usually say that we have to impose our will on others. Matter of fact, we don't do that. We understand intellectual liberty as well, and reading books, and even during the time we had the communists at their peak, we were still allowed to read books about communism. So we protected that pretty well. But when it comes to personal liberty and personal lifestyles and the way people live and the way they eat and drink and smoke, it seems like we can trust people about their soul and the hereafter and their intellectual life and their brains, but we don't trust people into making their own decisions on what they're going to do with their own body, and I think we should. About the wars around the world and the atmosphere of the Patriot Act and others, how it undermines our liberties. But actually, the war on drugs has been a real detriment to our personal liberties and has done nothing to reduce the use of drugs. So we ought to look at that. Prohibition didn't work. Alcohol is a very dangerous drug. There's probably more dangerous than all the other drugs. As bad as the illegal drugs today are. Alcohol is probably the deadly drug when you think of the accidents that happen and the people who use it excessively and get sick from it. But we still, if a person is an alcoholic, we still look at them in a medical fashion and say, why don't we help you? If you're an alcoholic and you haven't committed a violent crime, we don't put you in prison. We try to help you. It's a medical problem as much as anything. If you commit a violent act, that's a different story. But most people in prison today, due to our drug laws, and our prisons are flooded. And it's a very unfair system on the way that works too. It's very discriminatory who ends up in prison. But the drug war is something that is costing us a lot of money, and they get no offer of treatment. It should be treated as a disease if somebody is addicted to a drug. But also states' rights could help this a whole lot. I think it was today I had somebody call in and they were talking about who should decide the marijuana laws if you're in a state that legalizes marijuana. And this individual that called in said that he was using it for medical reasons and getting some benefits from it. And of course, I'm sympathetic with that, both medically and making personal decisions. But his question wasn't my personal attitude, medical attitude, or actually how the law should be written. His was, what's the constitutional position on that? So if California says that if you're sick and you go to a doctor and you get a prescription, you can use marijuana for a certain disease, should the federal government come in and arrest that person and put him in prison? The answer is no. We don't need that. We don't need to be stopped. It's gotten very much carried away because addiction in this country is a serious problem, and but it has to be dealt with as individuals and through our families and our churches. But if you look at problems, there's probably many-fold greater problems with prescription drugs than there are with the illegal drugs. So there's a lot of lot of wars going on, but the biggest war that we have to stop is the war on our liberties, the war on our ability to earn a living and take care of ourselves. It's nice for me to get up here and say, I want to get you your liberties, I want you to take care of yourself. But believe me, you need the conditions improved, so there's a healthy environment and you have the sound money. So there is a lot of responsibility of government. Some people say to me, oh, you don't want any government, you just want anarchy and no regulations. No, there are strict regulations by the marketplace. You have to live up to your contracts, you can't steal from people, you can't defraud. And today the government's always interfering with the contracts, they're always interfering, they commit the counterfeiting, they counterfeit the money. So the government's responsibility is to protect the marketplace, and under those conditions, we would have a much better chance to take care of ourselves. You know, we talk about the problems the students have, this $1 trillion they know they're getting out of college. Yeah, they would like to pay it off, and it was an ill-funded program, but how can they pay their debt if they don't have jobs? So yes, we have responsibility. Same way with regulations. The regulations are really strict. You can't violate a neighbor's property, you can't violate a neighbor's air or water, and it's very important that we understand that. But the marketplace would have handled the crisis a lot differently here, because of this interventionist government and special interest government and the lobbyists having control. When the crisis hit, the wrong people got bailed out. Under the marketplace, there will still be people going bankrupt, but if they made a mistake and didn't give us the right product, that's what is supposed to happen. They're supposed to go bankrupt. And my contention is that we need to restore confidence in liberty, how it works, why private property is better than government property, why the bureaucrats can't decide what is right for you. They don't, they tend to make mistakes, that's one reason, but they can't know what we want to do. They don't know what our personal habits should be. They don't know how we want to spend our money. We might not want to save our money, but you just can't depend on somebody else if you mess up. And it is individual, yes, it's individual liberty, but it's individual responsibility. And we were warned at the time, and Adams warned, he says, you know, freedom works in a moral society. So maybe we're getting exactly what our society has given us because of the dependency and the manipulation and the taking benefits from government. But I sense a change in this country. I sense a change even in these last 4 years. The people have changed their tune. They are looking at this economy differently. The young people, especially at the university, are fantastic. They're looking at this carefully. They're looking at the Federal Reserve. And believe me, I'm getting a lot of support because the statistics now show that a large majority, maybe even up to 70% of the American people are saying it's time to stop these wars and bring our troops home from Afghanistan. Problems I see and how I want to help and do my very best, it really depends on the people changing their minds on what the role of government should be. And that is what my goal is. I invite you to join with me in this effort. There's every reason to believe that, yes, we can come out of this, but we can't come out of it by promoting the status quo, having the same people doing the same thing over and over again. Something new. All we have to do is look at our traditions, look at our Constitution, look at what we've had in the past. We can even make it better. We can refine it and improve upon it. I've never said we had a perfect gold standard, but I think we should have something backing our currency. We should use something honest. We can even improve on it. So there's no reason to believe that we have to go backwards. All we have to do is go back and pick up the pieces and move forward and improve upon it. But we have to have a clear understanding of our responsibilities and what the government responsibilities are and what our responsibilities are around the world. We are a generous nation, and when people in this country get tempted to say, well, we have to take care of this problem, let's send foreign aid and do all this, believe me, we as a generous people will be even more generous. Even when we have bad times, the American people are generous and they help around the world. But I would say that if we have this, a great improvement in our free society, a great improvement in our prosperity, we will even become more generous. And the best message we can spread is the message of liberty. That is my goal, and I welcome you here tonight, and thank you for coming.